Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Heritage Coalition of Glastonbury's Seeing the Forest Through the Tree series. This is the second installment of three. This evening's episode or installment is entitled Advocacy and Education. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome our two distinguished guests, our presenters this evening, Thomas Worthley of the University of Connecticut, Department of Natural Resources and the Environment, and Eric Hammerling, Executive Director of the Connecticut Forest and Park Association. We will begin with Tom and Eric will follow. Welcome, Tom. Thomas Worthley wears many hats, and it's not an easy guy to introduce, but let me give a stab at it without being tethered to my reading glasses. Tom has a background as a forestry practitioner, both as a certified forester and as an operations manager. Has a long tenure at the University of Connecticut, starting in 1996, as an outreach educator, reaching out to both public and private entities, and as an undergraduate professor, teaching courses in dendrology, forest management, and silviculture. In addition, Tom is coordinator for the CLEAR, University Center for, Land Use, Education, and Research, if I've got that correct. Very qualified guy to be answering any of your questions on Connecticut's forests. Secondly, we have Eric Hammerling, the Executive Director of Connecticut Forest and Parks Association. I believe Connecticut's oldest and longest standing conservation organization, dating back to 1895, with its roots just down the road in Portland from where Glastonbury residents are sitting this evening. Eric's got a 30-year plus career in conservation. Came to Connecticut Forest and Park in 2008 from the Farmington River Watershed Association. He is the lead advocate at the organization to the Connecticut State Legislature, advancing the Connecticut Forest and Parks legislative agenda. He also has had several roles chairing advisory committees to state government. Most recently and notably as chair of the Forest Subcommittee, which advises the Governor's Council on climate change. Hopefully I've covered the basics. Tom will speak to, actually both guests will speak to kind of the conditions on the ground, the importance of our forests with regard to forest ecosystems, and in the face of climate change and the uncertainty around that. Forest management, why it's important. And Eric will certainly join in with legislation and whatever news you might have from the Connecticut legislature. That being said, I've gone on long enough. Welcome to all of you. And I guess we'll get underway with Tom.
Why, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Michael. I first met Michael when he was an attendee at one of the seminars of the Coverts project. And I know Michael is a very passionate advocate for wildlife, for birds, for habitat management. And I thank you for the invitation here this evening. I guess at this point, I'm supposed to share my screen. I do have some graphics to go along with my remarks this evening, and at this point, I'll pop them up there. If I can find the right screen here, and we'll there. I hope you can see that okay. It's a slide that begins with Connecticut Forest. We all live in the woods. And what I hope to talk about this evening is a little bit about current conditions, some forest health issues that we need to be aware of, the discussion around the changing climate and the role of forests, and then to talk to you a little bit about what we do in forestry extension at the University of Connecticut and some of the programs and research projects that I'm involved in. so that you're aware that this work is ongoing as well. We wouldn't have the forest resource that we have today without a long, almost 400-year history of land use and land use changes, in some cases land abuse, where we had forest land that covered almost 98% of the state, and only to have it cleared away for agriculture at one time or another, grow back to be cleared away again, grow back to be cleared away again for any variety of uses. And the forest we have around us today is a result of that activity. And we'll talk about more about that in a few minutes. We're estimated to have between 56 and 60% of our land area covered with forest cover in the traditional rural sense. We actually, in the state of Connecticut, have about 75% of the land area of the state covered with a tree canopy, but a portion of that canopy is in urban and suburban settings and in small patches of trees. It's not all, forest in that rural sense. This is a very typical satellite image of what our landscape looks like. There's lots of green. It's fragmented by things like highways and roadways and power lines and residences and various other things that break it up. But what's not necessarily so visible in this image is the fact that it's also quite parcelized. A lot of those areas of contiguous forest are broken up into various ownerships of various types. There's tens of thousands of different forest owners in the state of Connecticut and dozens of different ownership types. And each and every one of them has their own interests, their own reasons for owning forest land, their own long-term interests in what they would like their forest to be in the future. And we can't look at any map without saying, oh, where's my house? Well, there it is, right there. Some of our forest cover looks like this. It's in places that are more densely settled. It's an urban or suburban tree canopy that provides a variety of benefits from noise pollution control and air pollution control to stormwater, reduction of stormwater impacts, habitat for birds that and other animals that can take up residence in these places that and cohabitate with humans, so to speak. There's a variety of statistics, and we're very fortunate to have a recent update of Connecticut's Forest Action Plan. This is a document that is prepared every 10 years by the Connecticut Deep Forestry Division. And the most recent one was edited and put together by a fellow by the name of Dan Paracchio, who did a very creditable job of putting together a document that's quite readable, very, very full of information. It's a great reference, easy to use, and logical in its presentation, and thorough, extremely thorough. Now, he didn't write every word, and he got at least 5 pages of edits from me in one of the drafts, but be that as it may, Dan did a wonderful job with this, and I use this in my forest management class, and here's the link to it that you can use to find it online and read it yourself. And in it, you'll find some things like these maps I have showing the forest cover for the state of Connecticut and all the statistics that go along with that. And then the comparison to what are really the core forest areas, those large forest blocks that are greater than 500 acres, a much, much smaller proportion of the total forest area, but very important from a habitat and a contiguity standpoint. One of the statistics out of that, or one of the charts out of that document shows the changes in forest land over time. in terms of different land uses. And we could see back at on the beginning on the left-hand side of this chart in 1985 to 1990, we lost almost 30,000 acres of, or 40,000 acres of forest land, only to see it turn into developed land. Whereas in most recent times, development seems to have slowed quite a bit, and the loss of forest land seems to have leveled off in the last 5 to 10 years. And so that's a positive thing. And the policy recommendations that are being made to the state of Connecticut, that we have policies in place that call for no net loss of forest land. In fact, a goal to increase forest cover. We would like to see some of those acres of forest land show up on the other side of the chart as a gain. The forest we have around us is unique in that much of it started to grow all at the same time from, as we mentioned, some other land uses. And much of the forest is comprised of trees that are in that 80 to 120 year age group. Not so many young trees, not so many middle-aged trees, but lots of trees that are getting older, that are maturing. Now, I say that with a little bit of a caveat, in that most different species of trees have different life expectancies, and some can live to be a very old age. Some trees can live to be 300 or 400 years old. Some are done growing by the time they're 80 years old. So depending on what species we're talking about, this is potentially could be an issue. We are dominated by a forest type, a cover type that's comprised mainly of oak and hickory. Almost 75% of our forest cover is that hardwood type that's primarily oak and hickory. There are other components, of course, but as a forest type, oak hickory is dominant in our landscape. Remember that as I move on to the next slide, because we have some statistics here about the most abundant species of trees. And he has it in two different tables, one by millions of cubic feet of wood, that's volume. It's an estimate based on allometric equations, but they estimate that red maple is the most dominant species by volume. It's also the most dominant species in terms of numbers of trees in the landscape, total numbers of trees. Northern red oak, of course, is second, black oak, eastern white pine in terms of volume. But if you look on the right-hand side in terms of number of stems, number of trees, the landscape is dominated by maple, birch, and beech. Now you might say, if we go back to the other slide, if we're dominated by an oak and hickory canopy, how is it that maple, birch, and beech are the most numerous trees out there? Well, the answer to that is that there's a large number of small, not necessarily younger, but smaller maples, birches, and beeches growing underneath that oak canopy. And they are species that are more tolerant of shade and that live a longer period of time, or have the ability to live a longer period of time. They have a longer life expectancy. An American beech tree can survive for 100 years in the shade as a knee-high little thing waiting for the opportunity to grow, and then live to be 400 years old if something doesn't happen. And so we have large numbers of these shade-tolerant hardwoods underneath our oak canopy. And why that's important is because this represents the future forest mix once the oak canopy has passed along, assuming nothing else happens to it. And so this presents us with a management question about what we value in terms of the forest composition. There's nothing particularly wrong with maple, birch, and beech. They're beautiful trees. But the 400 plus different species of wildlife that depend on the acorn crop in our landscape might disagree with me. In the center of this chart, we show that most of the forest land in our state is owned by private individuals. And a little bit less than a third, a little bit less than 30% is owned by governments, state and local governments, and a small sliver of federal land that's forest land. But the private here includes things like families, land trusts, game clubs, summer camps, water companies, various other entities that can be considered private. There are some other statistics associated with this chart. On the left-hand side, it's showing that we do actually have a gain in terms of total amount of wood out there in the last year. And over on the right-hand side, you can see that the total losses from mortality in removals are dwarfed by the amount of wood that grows out there every year in our forests. And so we're gaining from a wood standpoint, even though we live in a very parcelized and fragmented environment. If we look at that private ownership, the woodland ownership, and we look at just the family woodland owners, take out the land trusts, take out the game clubs and so forth, it's estimated that there's just under 140,000 different woodland owners. For those 140,000 family woodland owners, we have 3 service foresters. We have 1 extension forester, that's me, who spends half his time teaching classes on campus. And so the availability of public advice for family woodland owners is stretched very, very thin here. And it's something that our state should take a look at. They own almost half of Connecticut's forest land. And the average parcel size is 6.2 acres. Now, when I first came to work at the state of Connecticut 25 years ago, the average parcel size in the state of Connecticut was 15 acres. And so an equivalent amount of forest land keeps getting divided into smaller and smaller pieces. About 9,000 of these families, or 6% of the total number of families, own more than 25 acres each. And that accounts for a significantly large chunk of the total family forest ownership. What's important to know is not all of these parcels are protected in any way. In fact, most of them are at risk of being divided again or being transferred in terms of ownership to somebody else, being transferred in an intergenerational way, divided amongst siblings or so forth and so on. And so it is a concern with respect to how the forest is managed in the future. We do have some forest health issues. Top of the list these days, at least from a discussion standpoint, is the long-term climatic conditions. I'm sure we'll hear more about that when Eric talks about the Governor's Council on Climate Change. We have biological impacts and invasive plants and insects and human activities as well, not just activities in the woods, but activities like I just spoke of, intergenerational transfer and policy decisions. Certainly, climate has an effect on forests, and much of the discussion these days is the role that forest plays with respect to climate change. Severe weather patterns are expected in the future, and this is going to have an effect on forests, changes in the amounts of precipitation when it arrives during the course of the year, the temperature fluctuations we get in the wintertime being very stressful, and the introduction of species that haven't been here before as a result of temperature changes. And so lots of the discussion is around the role of the forest, and these conversations tend to be focused on carbon sequestration and storage, and that's two different things. Carbon storage refers to the total amount of carbon that is stored in the forest in terms of woody material and above ground portions of the forest and below ground portions of the forest, and how much carbon is being stored. And sequestration is about the rate at which forests draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And those are two different questions very often, and decisions need to be made about what's more important. The other part of the conversation is about how the forests are affected by climate change, and the management discussions are focused on resilience and adaptation. I know that you heard a little bit about this in the previous session that you had, and my comment about that is that in order for any carbon sequestration or storage to take place, the forest must be resilient and must be able to adapt to the changes. And a resilient forest is one with a diversity of species, a diversity of age classes, and the ability to respond to changes. Two publications that are of interest that will give you a terrific grounding in this topic. If you're interested, of course, is on the right-hand side, the report of that forest subgroup of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and there's a link there. Also, a publication that recently came out of a partnership between the University of Massachusetts and the University of Vermont. Two colleagues of mine, Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro, put out this forest carbon publication that's very readable and very understandable, and I encourage you to look it up. We have biotic impacts in the forest affecting how things are taking place in the future. Here's a stand of beech trees, which normally would be thought of the late successional forest, trees that will live to be a ripe old age, that last a long time, that'll store a lot of carbon, get to be big trees. And here they are infested with beech bark disease. I don't expect these trees to last very much longer. I don't know what will happen after that. There's a new disease of beech on the horizon, beech leaf disease. And so whether we'll ever see this kind of condition again remains to be seen. Another photograph here of Asian jumping worms, and if you haven't heard of that, you'll find out that they're having dramatic impacts on the organic material in the forest floor, and that's going to have a tremendous impact on the ability of forest soils to hold nutrients and store carbon. And then, of course, we have our friend Bambi, who tends to eat every native plant in sight, and the challenges associated with regenerating what we consider to be desirable species and protecting them from being browsed is a big challenge for forest managers these days. We have non-native invasive plant species that take advantage of the fact that deer don't eat them because they're not familiar with them. Tree of Avon, Norway maple, all being found in the woods in some degree. Black locust, very useful species, but not native to our area. And so there's a big debate about whether that's a good species to grow or not. Multiflora rose, a great habitat for some nesting birds, but a terrible food source for a lot of other things. Asiatic bittersweet, taking over many of the meadows and open woodlands. And public enemy number one in my book, Japanese barberry, because of the way it holds back native vegetation, and it also has human health implications. And then finally, we see autumn olive all over the place in any abandoned open place. And While this produces edible berries, and even the birds eat them, they're not particularly nutritious. We have non-native insects. Here's a photograph of Gryllus planipennis, emerald ash borer. This little guy was found in a hole in an ash disc that I was actually working on sanding down. And I thought that was a kind of an interesting find, but I was not surprised. They're not very large, but they're big enough to see. Very pretty insect, non-native, and this is the kind of damage they do to ash trees. They've been moving throughout the state since 2013, and we expect all the overstory ash to disappear. It's only a matter of a few years. Ash is a highly valuable wood from a wood product standpoint. It has been a very valuable species for a number of insects and birds that live all or part of their life cycle on ash trees. But and so in my management decisions, I tend to do things that try to maintain some component of ash on the landscape, even if I'm salvaging ash that's infected by emerald ash borer for wood products. I will try to harvest the trees before they're dead, in the hopes that they'll resprout and we'll at least have some young ash trees on the landscape. If they die, well, then they're dead. They're not going to resprout. We've all seen Lymantria dispar. This is the insect formerly known as gypsy moth. And there's a photograph here of gypsy moth egg masses hatching little young ones before they get to be big, ugly, fuzzy bugs. And the type of damage that they did between 2016 and 2018 was dramatic across the eastern part of the state. We lost the entire canopy on tens of thousands of acres of forest land. We lost tens of thousands of roadside oak trees as a result of the combination of gypsy moth and drought and some other factors in the environment. So in extension forestry, we tend to try to work on these issues. And one of the things we try to do is bring some information and education to woodland owners. We have a program focused on wildlife habitat management that I mentioned before called the Coverts Project. You can check with me or my partners at the Connecticut Forest and Park Association for more information about that. Another endeavor with whom we're with the CFPA that we're involved in is the Master Woodland Managers Program in partnership with Connecticut Deep. And this is a more extensive, deeper dive into what it means to be a woodland manager, aimed once again at woodland owners. I experiment a bit with small scale management methods. I mentioned that average size of the forest parcel being less than 10 acres. And so we need to have scale appropriate tools and equipment and techniques in order to be able to do effective forest management on parcels that small. The big high production timber management industry is really irrelevant for somebody who only has 12 acres of forest. We try to direct people to where they can find assistance, both financial assistance and technical assistance for forest management. And we've been involved for some time with the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station on programs to control ticks and invasive plants. I try to promote local wood products. We're involved in a big research effort with the Eversource Energy Center called Stormwise. You can hear more about that. There's an article in today's Yukon Today about the Stormwise initiative. I'm involved in the management of 2,100 acres of Yukon forest land. As I mentioned, we deal with forest pest issues, and a big project we have going on at the moment is adaptive silviculture research. In the programs for woodland owners, we cover a variety of topics. And what's important there is that it's not me, I stand in the background. It's the experts we bring in to talk about various topics that make these programs so successful. In this photograph on the right is my friend and colleague, Peter Picone, who is a wildlife habitat expert. And if you've ever spent an hour in the field with Peter Picone, why, you go home with a smile on your face. He is just so knowledgeable and so enthusiastic and so passionate about what he does. It's infective. As I mentioned, we experiment with small scale techniques for managing woodlands and doing some of the tasks that need to be done, and have learned a lot in order to be able to teach people the skills that they require, the capabilities of these equipment, what the costs are versus the benefits, and what the limitations of these techniques might be. As I mentioned, we're involved in continuing to experiment and teach people about controlling invasive species, particularly Japanese barberry. A whole body of research came out of some of our early experiments on ticks, Lyme disease, mice, and their relationship to barberry patches in the forest. The Stormwise initiative is about keeping the lights on, understanding that the problem is that 90% of power outages are tree failure related. And we engage in vegetation management, social science, tree biomechanics, et cetera, to research this problem. And we base this idea that roadside forests can be managed to have the correct species, age structure, and density so as to be more storm resistant. They don't have an engineering problem. We have a forest management problem. We take what we know about trees, that trees with space to grow are healthier trees, that trees will grow towards the sunlight wherever that is. Trees that are allowed to move in the wind will develop wind resistance, and that we need to be growing the right trees in the right place. And if we apply these things to these concepts to unmanaged roadside forests, we hopefully will have fewer tree related outages. The outages that do occur will be of shorter duration, and that we can perhaps avoid the whole trimming thing and manage these forests from the ground while maintaining the forest functions and keeping those roadside forests in place for the aesthetics of the communities. It takes a village, though. It takes an awful lot of cooperation, and that's kind of where we're at with the project, is figuring out the formula for engaging all the different stakeholders and have somebody being willing to take the plunge and support the work that needs to be done out there. Here's a quick illustration of identifying the trees that we really don't want to be growing along that roadside forest and removing them. Thinning the forest down, growing some different trees in their place, creating a different structure that's less dense, that will be less of a problem in a windy condition. We manage Yukon Forest for a variety of different purposes to give students experience on the ground. We dabble in some old-fashioned ways of doing things as well as new technologies, and teach techniques. We make a lot of firewood in the process, as well as some other wood products. Recently, I was involved in an initiative called the Slow Storm, where we examined the degree and extent of tree mortality due to the gypsy moth or Lymantria dispar activity, along with the other mortality problems we have with emerald ash borer and what that involves. You may remember the vast areas in eastern Connecticut that were defoliated. And it really is an eastern Connecticut phenomenon during that time, and but involved millions and millions of trees and tens and thousands of acres of woodland, and had a tremendous impact on those forests. This is an area in Chaplin, on one of the state parks, where the entire canopy was lost. And who knows what the value of those trees might have been, what the importance they might have had for wildlife in that area or aesthetics. Nobody will ever go in and salvage those trees. They'll be standing dead trees for a long time. The silver lining on the cloud, though, is what you see at the ground level is a very lush growth of vegetation that one had 3 years or 2 or 3 years worth of defoliation, full sunlight, and then the loss of the tree canopy continued that full sunlight. And so that young forest is now growing great guns. Now, what's important to find out is what the composition of that forest is. We see some oaks, we see some birch, we see some cherry, we see some maple along with the shrubs and the sedges there. And it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time and whether there's anything we can do to enhance some kind of predetermined desirable condition. One of the research endeavors we're involved in is adaptive silviculture for climate change. We are an affiliate of a large national project on this, and we have an experimental site that is in place on Mohegan State Forest in Scotland, where we've laid out some silvicultural treatments and we'll be monitoring them over a long period of time. There's a wide partnership of faculty members at UConn that are involved in this, and research graduate students as well as undergrads who are doing work on the ground there. So we are, like I said, we are affiliated with other projects, similar projects nationwide, and look forward to how this project develops. I'll leave you with this slide. And this is a slide to illustrate that I'm not really worried about the forest. If we go away, the forest will grow back, will take over. And it's not a matter of whether the forest grows back, it's the natural vegetative cover for our part of the world. What we need to be concerned about is, will the forest as we have it today continue to fulfill the needs of the society or the demands the society places on it? And that's why it's important to evaluate our forests, manage our forests widely, and try to keep as much forest on the landscape as we can. Thank you. I'll turn things over to Eric, or turn them back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Tom. And we will proceed right into Eric if we can, so we can leave as much time as possible for question and answer following his presentation. Thank you.
So Tom, if you would unshare your screen, I will share mine. All right. So it is an honor to be here tonight, and certainly to follow my good friend Tom Worthley, who really is, I would say, the preeminent educator in Connecticut about forest issues. He's an amazing resource, and it's wonderful that he was able to be here tonight and to set things up for extending the conversation, not so much about some of the forest health issues, though I will touch on some of those, but some of the people side of the equation, and thinking about the policies that can help to support a more resilient forest for the future. Tom mentioned a concept of no net loss of forest, which is something that is built into what I'll be talking about. But I'll get right into it and start with considering things from the perspective of a lawmaker who is making policy. If you've had a sit-down conversation with a lawmaker, they will typically talk about a few different things and ask you some key questions. What are we trying to solve here? What's the problem? Is it a change in policy that will make a difference? Or perhaps it's an issue of education or management or other actions that could be taken. Will policy make a difference? Is the issue urgent? Because when they ask that question to you, they're also saying, can we kick this can down the road a little bit? Or do we need to address this now? And then, they want to know, is this issue politically divisive? Is caring about the future of forests in Connecticut a Democrat or Republican or independent or socialist or issue? And, folks want to know, what is the lay of the land as we think about the future of the land? So using that as a little bit of a frame for thinking about policy, those key questions, I'll touch on some of the ground that Tom just touched on, just in a slightly different way. So when you're thinking about what's the problem, well, Tom mentioned that we have a nice amount of forest cover in Connecticut, if it's somewhere between 55 and 60%. But there are some challenges with how that forest is split up amongst many people and uses. We have around 72% of our forests are privately owned. Most of those are relatively small acreage, as Tom mentioned. 10 acres or fewer is really the dominant ownership amount. And our population of forest landowners is aging. And if you took some of the findings from the report that was done by Mary Terrell a few years back, where she looked at the ages of a sampling of forest landowners, you might suggest, if you extrapolated from that, that maybe as many as 90% of today's forest landowners are older than age 55. Now, I'm not suggesting that age 55 or 56 is old, but that is a time when individuals are thinking about their legacy, what will be the future of their forest property. And that's a really important time to be talking with them about a variety of options, from management to if they want to put an easement on their land to ensure that it's forest forever, et cetera, et cetera. There are some lands that are conserved under state ownership, or some municipalities own forest land that should be forest forever. Some land trusts own forested properties that will likely be, in some form of forest forever. And there are easements that help to ensure that, legally a place might stay as forest. And we also have some incentives in our state, like the Public Act 490 program that some of you might be familiar with, that helps to ensure that when forest landowners who have 25 or more acres of forest pay their property taxes, they pay them at the level of considering that land to be forest versus it to be potentially developable, putting houses on property, which would really increase their tax burden tremendously. And so that's a nice incentive for people to keep their land as forest. And then there are also some state grant programs that help to acquire land, again, to keep it in forest. I would say, these are really important to know about, but are probably inadequate to the task at hand, I would suggest. Because as Tom mentioned, there is a lot of fragmentation, parcelization that is taking place across the landscape. And when Yukon Clear did their kind of landmark study, years ago on forest fragmentation, if you look at the large core forest, which is in this instance, core forest of 500 acres or more, about 130,000 acres over that 30-year period between 1985 and 2015 was either lost or fragmented. Now, I'm not suggesting that 130,000 acres of forest all of a sudden were turned into pavement, but those 500 plus acre core forested areas are now in smaller pieces. 130,000 acres worth are in smaller pieces today. And that has a lot of impacts on forest health. And I would say when it comes to forest health, size does matter. But moving on. Tom also mentioned some of the threats that are out there to forest health. And he, I won't cover that same ground, but there are many challenges, and many of the challenges that our forests are facing today are also made worse by climate change. And really the resiliency of forests can be exacerbated by can exacerbate these existing problems. So forests in the future might become less of a carbon sink than they are today, result of more intense weather stressors, competition with invasive plants, attacks by forest pests, overbrowsing by deer, and other climate exacerbated factors can lead to higher tree mortality, reduced carbon storage overall. Again, there is a difference between storage and sequestration, but I'm talking about storage here. And basically, there are lots of impacts of climate change on forest resiliency that are considered right now to be likely, but not fully understood. And there is lots of inherent variability in climate change, as well as the natural systems that are being impacted. But it does give us more of a challenge to think about our forests in the future under a different climate. How healthy will they be? I do want to mention one thing, and knowing that this series talks about the forest through the trees, there are differences between thinking about forests and trees that, especially in a policy context, are really important to consider. Generally speaking, a forest is usually defined as 1 acre or more of trees, and it's 1 acre or more that is stocked at a 10% level or greater. And trees are less than 1 acre of trees in smaller clumps or as individuals. And that's why, because we're looking at two different things here, especially if you think about the difference between the forest that you have in nearby Meshomask State Forest and Glastonbury, or the trees that you might have in front of your home, smaller clump of trees. Now that means that the challenges between those two groups, forests or trees, and of course, yes, I know a forest is comprised of trees. I get it, but when you're talking about trees, in general, you're talking about more intense scrutiny, because these are the trees that we see. These are the trees that are cared for and impacted more visibly. And when you're talking about forests, you might have some different considerations from larger acreages and how those are managed for different purposes. It's just, it is a little bit of apples and oranges. And I just wanted to make that point again. In the policy context, there is a difference between forests and trees. So one other thing that's important to know, and now I'm switching, you'll notice, to urban tree cover. So this is trees, is that in our largest cities, we have some real considerable issues with trying to sustain or maybe even grow our urban tree cover. And if you look at our major cities, and this is from a study that was done over a decade ago, Bridgeport, 27% urban tree cover. Now, again, this is not forest in Bridgeport. It is, well, with some exceptions, it is, how much of the city of Bridgeport is actually covered by trees. Hartford, this 26% figure from a 2010 study is now is low. And the city of Hartford published, some of you may be familiar with, a plan to increase their urban tree canopy by 10% over the next 50 years. It's a big undertaking, but a really important one. So it's just important to know that there are differences between trees and forests, and between tree cover and forest cover in different parts of the state. And there are also some significant inequities when you really get into the weeds a little bit further, talking about urban tree cover. Essentially, there is a lack of tree cover in lower income, primarily Black and brown neighborhoods, like here in New Haven. With less tree cover comes greater heat island effects, greater vulnerability to heat extremes, and other stressors that are key determinants of health for the community. Conversely, those areas with greater tree canopy cover in general had cooler surface temperatures, as well as higher median incomes. Again, there are some considerable inequities that, as we think about trees, the lack of trees, and our future for trees, there are those issues that need to be addressed as well, and again, in a policy context. So I'll go back to one of those key questions right up front on policies. Is this issue urgent? Well, what I list here are, several of the kind of combination of socioeconomic, climate, health, other benefits to people, climate, wildlife, ecosystems, neighborhoods. And I would certainly argue personally that if we want to retain these many benefits for our communities into the future, hell yes, it's urgent. But when you have to try to convince a legislator that it's urgent, it takes some doing, because there are a lot of things that are urgent. I would argue this is something that needs immediate attention. So, the question comes back to, all right, well, so what are we going to do? What can we do to try to ensure that our future forests and trees and communities are more resilient? Well, I was fortunate this fall, from September through the end of November, to lead a working group of 15 different organizations that came together, with lots of wonderful recent reports, like the Forest Action Plan, like the Forest Report to the Governor's Council on Climate Change, like some other reports that Tom mentioned, to say, okay, well, how can we find some common ground amongst a pretty diverse group of organizations to say, these are things that we can all support in a way that is not politically divisive, and actually come up with some consensus recommendations. And just to give you a flavor of the different organizations that were represented as a part of this, and I should say that, generally speaking, these folks who participated with me on this working group were fantastic to work with. But here you have, representatives of a full range of municipal interests, from big cities to rural towns, representatives of traditional and urban forestry, as well as farmers and tree wardens, advocates for equity and zoning reform, like Desegregate Connecticut, community developers like the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Connecticut, planners at the state and regional levels, conservation and sustainability organizations, et cetera, et cetera. This was not easy to find common ground amongst some organizations with some pretty diverse interests. But we did come up with some recommendations that I'll go through tonight. And again, these were the primary documents that we were drawing upon. A couple of these were mentioned. This additional one here, Taking Action on Climate Change and Building a More Resilient Connecticut for All, was a report that was put out by the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection in last January. that kind of went through all of the different reports to the Governor's Council on Climate Change and said, here are the top 61 things that we want to do for Connecticut. And amongst those, there are about 8 different recommendations that had a direct connection to forests. And I think it's an important report for folks to be aware of. But just suffice to say, that was our starting point in looking at how to find common ground and some consensus recommendations for, again, what we were calling the perfect future, the policy for resilient forests for Connecticut's future, perfect future. And in the report, we recommended some new state policies, some new state incentives, some things that really needed to be considered in the state budget. And I'll just say this, and Tom, you don't have to feel like you are a part of this at all. Tom works for UConn, is a state employee, cannot be an advocate for additional resources for the state. But one of the things that was identified in the report is to have one extension forester at UConn responsible for the entire state of Connecticut is absurd. That and I wish we had more Tom Worthleys, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there are some things that could be done by state agencies without a need for legislation or new funding, but we really hope that that's not all that they will do. So getting into the recommendations, and I'll try to go quickly here because I know we want to go to questions really soon. And I did see some really good questions that were put in the chat that I guess will be, maybe Jackie will be moderating some Q&A at the end. So again, there are a lot of recommendations, so I'll go through just a few on each slide. The state has a piece of legislation called the Global Warming Solutions Act that requires us to report on an annual basis. By us, I mean the state of Connecticut, on emissions. Emissions from the transportation sector, from the energy production sector, and from the housing sector. They have to report on emissions. These are greenhouse gas emissions. But what is not considered in the Global Warming Solutions Act is the important role that working lands, natural lands, soils, farmland play in storing and sequestering carbon. And we recommend that piece of legislation, the statutes be amended to require that be one of the things that we do as a state, is report on our essentially our forest, carbon, and soils inventory. There are also some goals that we have as a state for various things like protecting 21% of the state as open space is one of our key goals. I think we should have a new goal for our statewide forest cover and our urban tree cover. And what was recommended in the report is, and this is not going to sound like a big number, increasing our statewide forest cover by 1%. But keep in mind, that's about 18,000 acres of forest. And to increase our urban tree canopies by 5%. Both of these would be by the year 2040. Those are aggressive goals. But I would love for our state to get a bit more aggressive about how it's going to have additional forest for the future. So here's the one that will get some debate. I won't go into it too deeply tonight, but in the concept of no net loss of forest is looking at what some states do right now, like in New Jersey, like in Maryland. They have what they call compensatory reforestation policies that when certain actions are taken, require the planting of trees or other investments to improve forested or tree areas. What this, again, consensus recommendation from the group was that when the state of Connecticut, through actions, now we're not talking about actions like having state forests and managing them in various ways, but we're talking about when a state agency engages in activities that results in the loss of forest, and what the threshold for this in New Jersey is if they lose more than half an acre of forest as the result of a state agency, there's a requirement to do replanting or establish forest elsewhere. Interestingly enough, and this question came up in the chat, what are we going to do in Connecticut about all those trees that are removed by our Department of Transportation along our state highways that are not a problem for traffic? Well, if we had this policy in place, like New Jersey does, in New Jersey, when their Department of Transportation removes trees along a state highway, they have a requirement to compensate for that, offset that by planting trees. And in fact, a large percentage, maybe 75% of New Jersey's urban forestry program and the tree planting that takes place in their urban areas is funded by their state Department of Transportation to offset some of the lost trees that occur. When trees are removed by our state Department of Transportation in Connecticut, there is no offset. They're gone. That will be an area that is mowed with a few, spare trees for a long time. That's a loss in many ways to the state. And again, to have a compensatory reforestation program that deals with state agency actions, and there was some discussion about utility actions as well. That's what other states do, but there might again be a threshold where if a utility is doing removal of trees, we're not talking about trimming or other activities, but removal of trees above a certain threshold, there might be a requirement for the utility to make a community whole with replacing trees in some way. And there are already some cities like Hartford, like New Haven, that do have ordinances that require this, but this would make it a more broadly experienced benefit. Here I'll just mention again, in the interest of time, number 2 and 3 are kind of interesting. There are currently under the law a couple of tax incentives that corporations who acquire land and donate it to a land conservation entity like a land trust can take advantage of. But those tax advantages that corporations get are not currently enjoyed by individuals or other groupings of, like maybe an LLC, who might get together for the purpose of acquiring land. We'd like to see those current tax incentives be extended to individuals. And then lastly here, I think what Tom said about Stormwise is really important. And sometimes there are trees that are totally not the right tree to be planted under wires, and there are issues like that. But as we think about things like undergrounding of electric wires over time, electric infrastructure, that is a way that you have to worry less about trees growing up into the wires. It also increases the resiliency of the electric system as you make those investments. It's expensive. It will be over many years, but we might be able to worry a little bit less about trees of potentially tall stature that could grow in areas where you have undergrounding of electric infrastructure. I mentioned that we need more Tom Worthleys. Similarly, there are only 3 private land service foresters at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to cover the entire state of Connecticut. We need to double that, at least. It's wholly inadequate to the fact that most of our land owner base in the state is private, and we need resources for private landowners to ensure that they're thinking about all of their forest management and conservation options far into the future. All right, I think actually what I'm going to do is just encourage folks to follow up, read the report. There are lots of different things in there, and I won't belabor it with going into these in more detail. And we'll just go right to the Q&A period of tonight before we get too far behind schedule. But again, I did see a number of good questions that are being asked in the chat, and I don't know if Jackie or Michael, if you're going to facilitate Q&A, but let's go to that.
Thank you, Eric. Jackie? Jackie, I believe you need to unmute.
Yep, I'm unmuted. Yes. I'm just going to start at the top and just go sequentially. Some of these questions have been touched upon by our speakers, and I will let the speaker who can best address the question leap in when you know it's your area. Eric, I know you've talked a little bit about the first question that Shawnee Baldwin asked about the DOT. Do they have to consult with anyone before they cut down trees? So many trees that are not impeding traffic. You touched on that some, but do they have to get the prior authorization?
So no is the answer in most instances, because the state owns the right of way. The Department of Transportation is tasked with being the ones who manage and maintain that right of way. And so, if someone else owned the right of way, they would have to, engage in the typical, getting a permit to be able to do activities, but they don't. The Department of Transportation does have, and maybe if we have a little break in the action, I can find it and put it in the chat, but they do put together and have updated a state, vegetation management plan for the transportation system that kind of details what they do, and they do have some national engineering standards that they abide by when they are thinking about how much clearance there needs to be between trees and the highway. Though, just between us chickens here, I do think that there have been, many trees cleared downslope of highways that are not going to fall upslope. But it just happens to be, they have a budget to do it, and they do it. But the question was also asked about utilities and whether utilities are, required to do replantings, or, in most, and the answer there is in most instances, no. If you look at the budget for electric utilities to do vegetation management, and they are not small. Their budgets are between Eversource and the entity formerly known as United Illuminating. It's about $150 million combined for vegetation management. Now, some of that gets spent on paying traffic guards to ensure that they don't have accidents and things like that. But in that budget, it is for removals and trimming. It is not for planting. So, but that said, some people have negotiated with Eversource, and as Eversource has said, we'd like to remove those trees for this and that reason, People have said, you know what, I'll only allow you to do that if you plant trees here. And they have done that upon occasion, but that is not in general. They don't plant trees, they trim and remove. And I think they are also, one of the important funders of research, like Stormwise, that's looking at ways to have a more resilient roadside forest. But yeah, we could probably talk about that one for many hours.
Okay. Next question, Mary Algren asks, are there opportunities for private forest owners to learn stewardship strategies to manage their land? Tom, I think you touched on this some in your presentation, but you might want to just summarize again.
Yes, there are a number of programs out there, and the best thing to do is to contact the Connecticut Deep Service Forester for your territory. You look on the Connecticut Deep Forestry Division website, and you'll be able to find out the contact information for the service forester in your area. And if it's Glastonbury, you would probably be talking to Andrea Urbano. And they actually can come out and walk your woodland with you, spend a half a day, give you some information and get you connected to whatever the next steps will be. You can enroll in programs like the Master Woodland Manager Program. Information on that is available at CFPA. You can attend a seminar like the Coverts Project seminar, and you can get some information from me if you want to get in touch. Everybody has my email address. And so depending on what you want to accomplish, be out there who can spend some time with you and get you pointed in the right direction to get assistance that you need.
Okay, next question, Shawnee Baldwin asks, should we be killing these? I believe you're talking about the jumping earthworms. Tom?
I don't actively go around killing earthworms, although I have been known to pick a few up and feed them to the fish. And the fish love them. By the way, I don't bother with hooks anymore. I just go, right straight to the worm. There are some suggestions in a fact sheet at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station on ways of controlling them, but it's still one of those phenomena that's early yet. There's not a lot of research. There's not a lot of study about what the implications of them are. And so while I don't avoid, I don't worry about the earthworms, I don't actively try to kill them because there's just too many. It doesn't matter.
Okay, next, Mary Algren asks, also, how often does the DEEP offer information help to towns in managing large forested areas, such as the MDC property in East Glastonbury? And I will just mention, we need to close this up by 8:30, so we have a few more questions to address, so just use your time judiciously.
My response to that is that MDC has their own forestry staff, and it would be a good idea to contact them first. And but DEEP very often will respond to requests as opposed to just on some sort of schedule offer information. So contact MDC forestry staff first. If you do get in touch with DEEP, find out who you need to put that request to.
Great. Bruce Bowman asks, please compare and contrast forest management of a mature oak forest with dropping of trees to open canopy without a harvest allowing those trees to decompose versus a timber harvest with the introduction of invasives, degradation of soil health by equipment in this harvesting. This assumes no need for income from a harvest. 25 words or less.
25 words or less. If trees are allowed to, if you just open the canopy and allow trees to lay there, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. You'll still probably get invasive species, whether the soil is disturbed or not. It's more of a function of the proximity of a seed source for invasive species as opposed to soil disturbance. Soil disturbance is sometimes very important in terms of regenerating desirable species. White pine, for example, finds its best regenerating opportunities in places where some mineral soil is exposed, and they'll actually go out of their way to do that with equipment. And equipment doesn't necessarily degrade the soil health. Most modern timber harvesting equipment is designed to minimize soil health issues, although they do expose some mineral soil on occasion. Pushing the acorns and the hickory nuts into the soil is always a good idea. The decomposing trees will release carbon into the atmosphere slowly over time, and will release some carbon to the soil, having a positive benefit. But if you're interested in having some carbon tied up for a long period of time, the more valuable trees turned into some kind of durable wood product that has some value over time will, whether it's flooring or furniture or whatever the case may be, will last and keep that carbon sequestered for long enough to grow another tree. So those are my initial thoughts, but that's something we could talk about all night.
Great, thanks, Tom. Mary Algren asks, have you had any conversations with home insurance companies who ask new homeowners to cut down parts of trees that may be leaning over the houses? The severe trimming seems to create less stable trees, thereby making weaker trees unsightly yards and more chance of damage to homes.
Well, I can say that I haven't had conversations with home insurance companies, but I've certainly heard that comment from a few folks who have said that when they moved into their home, that was something that they were strongly encouraged to do. And in fact, were told by some insurers that they wouldn't provide home insurance for them if they didn't take that type of action. It's hard to know, obviously in every instance, it's hard to generalize that the trimming is going to be a bad thing. But I know that the insurance agencies are not typically thinking about the aesthetics. They're thinking about, what are the chances that they're going to have a potential payout, and wanting to reduce that as much as possible. There's no law that I'm aware of that would require insurance companies to have a different type of conversation with homeowners.
I actually had this happen to me. The insurance company came along and said, you're going to have to remove that tree or we're going to cancel your insurance. In my case, just because I'm a wood nerd, part of it was turned into firewood, part of it was turned into lumber, and part of it is now a piece of furniture. But be that as it may, my advice to the homeowner would be to get a competent arborist to do a trimming job correctly, so you don't have the problem of ugly trees or trees that are unstable or whatever the case may be. There is an organization out there called the Connecticut Tree Protective Association, and it's a good place to look for arborists who have the skills necessary to do projects like this correctly.
Okay, Shawnee asks, I've noticed a lot of lichen on trees in my backyard. Is this harmful to the trees?
Short answer, no. The lichen is just feeding on bark that is breaking down and weathering, and they're feeding on the nutrients that the bark is breaking up into as it weathers. Generally, it's a indication that the trees have been there for a long time and are fairly old trees with fairly thick bark.
Okay, this last question, I think, Eric, you may have answered a lot of this already, but let me read it. What is the time lag in a lead by example to cope with forest loss before there is real recovery of a new forest? Is replanting of trees adequate compensation of a lost forested area? If replantation done in the same area that was lost in the lead by example, can our climate sustain this?
Yeah, excellent question, Bruce. And you asked several really excellent questions.
Mhm.
I would totally agree that in many instances, if you're just thinking about, if losing a mature forest and replanting the same number of stems of a, brand new forest of the future, that's a loss. However, the compensatory reforestation plan and system that's being implemented in New Jersey and in Maryland takes that into account. So it basically is ensuring that if you're losing a more mature forest, the requirement of planting more trees and or paying money to acquire land to be forest and or there are lots of different variations on this theme. You just have a larger requirement to offset losses. Obviously, the ideal would be to avoid losing forest in the first place, and that's what I think is always encouraged. The other thing is if you have a requirement of an offset, that is in itself a little bit of a discouragement for removing trees. If people know that they need to well, in this instance, if the state knew that it needed to invest in additional forest land or other ways to offset it, they are less likely to take that action in the first place. So, again, it's another way of encouraging avoidance. And if avoidance is not possible, doing your best to try to compensate for loss. It is certainly not ideal, but it is much better than where we are right now.
Okay, I just want to point out to, oh, Tom, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah.
Part of the idea behind our Stormwise initiative, it doesn't just have to do with power lines, but it also has to do with transportation, and it could be applied very directly in the state DOT example, in that most of the stresses that trees come under along roadsides have to do with the fact that the forest is too dense. You have high density of trees, and so trees are struggling for space. The trees are struggling for nutrients, and in a place where they're also facing air pollution and water pollution. And so having a less dense forest of trees that still have time to grow, so age structure is another issue along the roadside forest, is a good solution in many cases. And if adopting a stormwise management approach or having to do compensatory planting were the two alternatives, maybe we could get the stormwise idea off the ground. It would require some training, it would require some cooperation, but the state or the utilities might just give it a good look.
Yeah. And I want to just also say that replanting, when you're talking about compensation, and they call it compensatory reforestation, replanting is not the only option. So Tom's absolutely right. There are other things that can be done that will have a benefit, whereas right now it's just a pure loss.
I want to point out to everybody, there are 2 links in the chat that may interest you. So take a look at that. And this will probably be our last question if we're going to honor our 8:30, but we'll see how quickly it goes. And this is Dave Algren asks, have any Connecticut towns adopted compensatory forest regulations like in New Jersey?
Well, there are a couple towns that have, like I mentioned before, ordinances that require when trees are removed that they are replaced in kind. So, for example, in New Haven, they have a replacement of the caliper size of a tree. So you think about how wide the tree is, and you would have to replace essentially the biomass of that tree in various ways. In Hartford, is a similar ordinance. Greenwich has a similar ordinance, but there isn't a requirement for municipalities to do this. And it is one of the things that if there were a no net loss of forest policy in Connecticut, is it would also come along with, like in New Jersey, model ordinances for municipalities to consider to do something like what's being done in New Jersey today.
Okay, I think we can squeeze in one more quick one. Dan Scribolo asks, hiking through the state forest in Glastonbury, I see a large number of dead standing trees and deadfall. Does DEEP consider this condition normal, healthy, or is this forest degrading?
I'll take that one. I believe that what you're observing is mortality as a result of emerald ash borer and previous Lymantria dispar activity along with drought, probably dead oak trees, dead ash trees. And no, DEEP does not consider that normal nor healthy. It's a result of invasive insects. And whether the forest is degrading or not depends on what they want it to be at some point in the future. If the natural regrowth that is coming in under those dead trees is desirable species that will reforest the area naturally, then yes, that would be fine. If it's invasive shrubs that are never going to let a desirable species or a native species grow at that location, then yes, it is a degraded condition. And so it depends on the conditions at the site, how you would classify that.
Okay, Mike, I'll turn it back to you to close up.
Thank you, Jackie. And thank you, gentlemen, very much. This presentation, both your presentations, certainly exceeded my expectations. I thought I was well read. 2 of the 4 documents I had covered, but I've got a couple new ones for continued reading through the cold months. I'll look forward to that. Can't thank you enough for being here. I do want to make a couple of quick announcements with regard to LHC. This will be recorded and posted to our website, which is lhcglastonbury.org. And you'll find some announcements about upcoming events. We have a snowshoe hike from the Rocky Hill Glastonbury Ferry coming up on January 30th. We'd love you to come out, spend the afternoon with us. That'll be from 1 o'clock. There will be a bat program mid-February. Kim Hargrave from Pequot Sapos Nature Center is going to be doing that for us.
That's
we'll
February
have registration
15th.
for that.
February
Thank you.
15th.
Thank you very much for remembering the date. And finally, I'm putting together the final installment, the 3rd installment of our forestry series, Seeing the Forest Through the Trees, which will focus on urban forestry and a little primer in understanding carbon, which we touched on tonight. So look for an announcement regarding that. Can't thank you all enough for participating tonight. Tom, Eric, thank you very much once again. And we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tom.